Something that should not be possible happened at the 2015 Pokemon World Championships. Something that has never happened before or since. The same team, or something very similar, finished first and second and third and fourth and fifth and seventh. But you're probably thinking, why should this not be possible? After all, if one team is just better than everything else, shouldn't that team dominate tournaments? It is a good question, but the answer is no. The short answer as to why is that there are a lot of Pokemon. Back in 2015, there were 690 legal Pokemon. Each of those Pokemon has 4 moves to choose from a pool of dozens, 20 different possible natures, tons of items that change how they play, maybe even multiple abilities to choose from. Look, you've heard all this before. There's a lot going on beneath the surface in a game like Pokemon, and that means that there's rarely one best team. The point is, the amount of variables is so high that it shouldn't be possible for everyone to have the same team, because that would mean that there was one best team, and then that team would become public enemy number 1 as other players found ways of countering it. Of course, these 6 teams at the 2015 World Championships do have some differences between them, but the fact that they're so similar is wild even still. Now, we do have to acknowledge that not all Pokemon are created equal. Some are naturally better than others in competitive formats, and these stars rise to the top. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking, why wouldn't everybody just use the strongest Pokemon? Why use anything other than the best? And doesn't the existence of this team just prove all those people right who say that competitive Pokemon is boring because everyone uses the exact same Pokemon? But again, the answer is no. And I present as evidence the fact that nothing like this has happened at any World Championships before or since. Under normal circumstances, popular teams follow a kind of life cycle. A team has a dominant showing somewhere. Maybe it's an official tournament, maybe it's an online tournament, maybe it's just on the ladder. If the team is good enough, other players will try it out and realize that it makes winning easier. More players will begin using the team, but then other players have incentive to try and counter this new popular team. They'll start planning for it, practicing against it, maybe even changing their teams to better deal with it. Sometimes, Pokemon that previously weren't viable will find a niche for themselves if they match up well into this shiny new toy. As players become better prepared, the team that was dominating will begin to fall in usage, often being eclipsed by the next hottest team, which will often have a positive matchup against it, and the cycle begins anew. Even if there was a team with mostly good matchups when it was introduced, that team just won't be able to dominate for long. Let's simplify things. We can think about this in terms of starter Pokemon. Let's say that Charmander just so happens to be significantly stronger than Bulbasaur or Squirtle on its own merit, and so most people run it. Actually, let's say it's more than most. Let's say that out of a 128 person tournament, 126 people buddy up with the fire type since it's clearly Game Freak's favorite. But then there's one Bulbasaur player and one Squirtle player. The Bulbasaur player might win a round against the Squirtle, but otherwise they're cooked to the temperature of several hundred degrees. But that lone Squirtle player has a field day. Yeah, sure, maybe they lose to the Bulbasaur, but otherwise, they're going to be knocking over Charmander after Charmander until they win the whole tournament. Obviously, this is a simplification, and it doesn't even really make that much sense because in order for everyone to want to use Charmander, it would need to be strong into other Pokemon that people were already using. But the point is, if everybody were to use the same team, you're bound to see some counters rise to the top. Even if Squirtle is the worst of the 3 in a vacuum, in the broader context of what everyone else at a tournament is using, it can still pop off. As far-fetched as this thought experiment might seem, this actually happened to me in a tournament back in 2016. I entered the Florida Regional Championships with Dialga, an extremely uncommon pick for the time. For whatever reason, at this specific tournament, a huge majority of the player base was using the combination of Rayquaza and Kyogre, 2 Pokemon who struggle against Dialga in a massive way. I ended up playing Kyogre after Kyogre and eventually won the tournament despite being one of only a few Dialga players in attendance. So, even if a team is popular and extremely strong, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be able to dominate a tournament, because eventually the players using it will run into a bad matchup. Unless, of course, the team only has good matchups. Now, obviously, the goal when you're building a team is to have only good matchups, but the reality is, it's just not possible. There are too many variables, there's too many things to consider, there's too many Pokemon to cover, it can't be done. Except, at this tournament, it looked not only possible, but like, what happened? In fact, this team did so well that the only logical conclusion that people thought they could draw was that it must have had exclusively good matchups, or at the very least that it didn't have any especially bad ones, which must mean this has to be the strongest team of all time, right? Well, kind of. I do think that this team is very, very strong, but I also think that it's fundamentally misunderstood. But before we talk about the misunderstanding, let's begin with sweet understanding. What was this team and what let it pull off this incredible run in the first place? This team actually has a name. Chalk. One letter for each Pokemon on the team. Cresselia, Heatran, Amoonguss, Landorus Therian, and Kangaskhan. The sixth Pokemon was flexible, but in the case of the world's winning team, we're dealing with Chalk T. But the T for Thundurus is silent because it doesn't quite roll off the tongue as well. Unless we're saying, Chalktua, gang on that thing!
Oh, brother, this guy's...
From looking at these teams, we can see that only 3 of them actually have all of the proper letters. The rest are Svalked and Shulked and Sialk. You can make the case that Chalk really only refers to the exact 5 Pokemon whose names are in the acronym. And to be honest, that does make a decent amount of sense. But these teams are still similar enough to at least raise an eyebrow. So, why these Pokemon specifically? Let's talk about what makes this team so fearsome. It might seem unintuitive, but we're going to start at the end of the word. The 2 Pokemon this team centers around, the ones not changed in any iteration, are Mega Kangaskhan and Landorus Therian. They might be at the end of the acronym, but that is not an indication of how strong they were. At the core, this is a bulky Mega Kangaskhan team. It was an archetype that had been around for a while, but Chalk became the best way to run it, which was notable because Mega Kangaskhan was undoubtedly the most powerful physical attacker in the format, and also probably the best Mega Evolution. Landorus Therian is debatably the second greatest Pokemon of all time in the official competitive format, and it had a real claim to the title before Incineroar came around. Oh my god, how am I talking about Incineroar in a video that took place this tournament from 2 years before Incineroar even released? Kangaskhan offers overwhelming physical damage, paired with a pretty nice speed tier, great natural bulk, 2 of the strongest priority moves in the game, and an absolutely broken ability that even lets it set up while dealing damage. Landorus Therian is similarly good at everything. Damage, bulk, speed, typing, move pool, ability. It has it all. Chalk may have made up 6 of the top 8 teams that year, but Landorus went 8 for 8. Moving on to the next letter, we find our next most popular inclusion in the team, Amoonguss. This is one of the best support Pokemon ever created. A deceptively tanky little mushroom who's probably the best grass type that we've ever seen, in part because of its access to both Spore and Rage Powder, 2 of the best supporting moves in the game. A few teams used Aegislash instead, who traded some of the support capabilities of Amoonguss for a little bit more damage. Most of the time though, this slot is Amoonguss. We just mentioned Aegislash because it also starts with A, but there is no H replacement for Heatran. Not one person was brave enough to use Heatmore. That's a real Pokemon, some of you don't believe me. Heatran's combination of stats, ability, and typing, which give it 2 immunities and a heap of resistances, lets it sit in the field and dish out damage turn after turn while shrugging off your opponent's attacks, which you might be starting to notice is a trend with this team. Its typing lets it handle opposing Amoonguss while also dealing with the other common Mega Pokemon in the format, such as Mega Salamence, Gardevoir, Charizard Y, Venusaur, and to some extent other Kangaskhan. With a substitute up against the right Pokemon, it became a nightmare to remove. Fire-type replacements for Heatran were often introduced thanks to another shift in the team that demanded role compression. For example, you could use Volcarona for redirection if you lacked Amoonguss, or Entei for a little bit more physical damage. Finally, Cresselia, the single best Trick Room setter in competitive Pokemon's history. Monstrously tanky, able to output decent damage over the course of the battle, and having access to Ice-type coverage moves like Ice Beam or Icy Wind was a huge boon on a team in a format with so much Landorus. It is no overstatement to say that all 5 of these Pokemon have a claim to be some of the absolute greatest competitive Pokemon of all time, and that was certainly true during the 2015 season. But like I said before, if all you had to do to win the World Championships was throw every strong Pokemon together onto the same team, we'd see that every year. What made Chalk so strong was not only that the Pokemon were individually extremely powerful, but they also had incredible synergy when combined. Yeah, you had the strongest Mega, strongest support Pokemon, strongest speed control Pokemon, but the way the team was pieced together made them all blend beautifully in a way that normally isn't possible for every shining star within a format. So, what made Chalk the exception? First of all, there's the bulk factor we've been talking about. Every single Pokemon on this team could tank hits, provided they'd been spec'd out properly. This leads to incredible consistency when using the team, where your Pokemon could survive for most of the battle, clicking reliable moves turn after turn. With so much natural survivability, a single critical hit, flinch, or prediction gone wrong would rarely cost you the game, something not true for teams with less staying power. Speaking of consistency, there's the moves themselves to talk about. Because Chalk made the battles go on so long, it had very high positive variance. That is a slightly nerdier way of saying this team made you feel like you should buy a lottery ticket. There's a lot of luck in Pokemon, but some of the hardest to plan around are the things like secondary effects of moves and critical hits. But if you're consistently clicking those moves while your opponents have to play defensive, you increase your chance every turn of hitting big, letting you turn an even matchup into an overwhelming winning one. This was basically playing inside of Hikari's domain expansion. The team also had ways of mitigating or avoiding incoming bad luck. Most of the moves were 100% accurate, and lots of them had secondary effects that could swing a fight if they got triggered. Landorus Rock Slide flinch, Cresselia Psychic Special Defense drops, or an Ice Beam freeze, Heat Wave burns from Heatran, or even the double chance at critical hits from Kangaskhan's Parental Bond. Not to mention how on the World Champion team, literally everything Thundurus does has a chance to just totally stop your opponent from moving for a turn or 10. In the long haul, it was statistically unlikely that the dice didn't roll your way, and by making battles go long with its incredible defensive backbone, every turn was a new roll that could spell disaster for unprepared foes. Not that this team was all defense. It had tons of offensive tools, including spread moves and multiple different types of coverage, and on top of that, the specific moves selected covered the very Pokemon that the team was built around, the strongest in the format. Cresselia's Ice Beam hits Landorus. Landorus's Earthquake and Kangaskhan's Low Kick hits Heatran. Heatran's Heat Wave hits Amoonguss. You get the picture. But even the attacking moves were just a part of a bigger whole for this team. It also had supporting moves to spare. Fake Out, Rage Powder, Spore, Substitute, Trick Room, all packed onto Pokemon already doing damage. Oh, and that's not even talking about the abilities, which were universally incredible. You have 2 immunity granters in Levitate and Flash Fire, the single best universal ability created in Intimidate, one of the best defensive abilities ever in Regenerator, and an offensive ability so disgustingly strong, it was probably number 1 on the list of things to nerf in the following generation. In essence, this team was just super stable. It would force you to play long battles over turns, often slightly weighted towards the Chalk Pokemon. And if the variance ever went the team's way, it became nearly impossible to come back from. This really reveals the overall ethos of this team. It's all about the value. This is a team with a focus on packing as many useful tools as possible into one complete bundle. Now, that probably sounds like what you're supposed to do in every Pokemon team, but what makes this one unique is that the Pokemon that provided the best tools were not only strong on their own, but they also had incredible synergy when used together. Sometimes, players will use a Pokemon that might not be as strong in a vacuum, but fits the specific team very well because of its synergy. And sometimes, you use a Pokemon that might be an awkward fit on your specific team, because its general tools are just so strong. But here, these Pokemon fit both columns. 5 strong pillars of a building with no weak foundation. I mean, this team just seems ridiculous, right? I'm only talking about upsides here. How stable it is, how hard it is to break through, how one bad turn of luck makes things so difficult. I mean, it must have dominated the entire 2015 season, right? Well, okay, maybe people just hadn't figured it out yet. Surely after the World Championships, people figured out how strong this team was, and then it just won everything, right? Like chalk all the way down. Okay. Well, maybe everyone was just trolling. Or maybe they had like a moral opposition to not use chalk. I don't know. I mean, we know that at Worlds, the team was just totally dominant. Look at the top 8 finishers. And I'm sure that if we look outside the top 8, we'll find even more. So, despite the team totally dominating the top 8 of the World Championships, it somehow failed to make a huge splash elsewhere. What does this mean? Well, this is exactly why I think that chalk is so misunderstood. And there's 2 main misconceptions. First, Contrary to what you might think, the 2015 format was not a year dominated by just one team. This graphic, which has become ubiquitous with the narrative that competitive players are lazy, just doesn't tell the whole story. In reality, this year was a varied, constantly developing format that just so happens to have been immortalized during its biggest tournament by a team that took the Western world by storm. Second, for years now, people have pointed to this top 8 graphic and used it as proof that Pokemon can be boring because if you just find the strongest Pokemon and put them all together, everyone will use the same thing. But in fact, Chalk proves the exact opposite of that. And even though I just built it up as this unassailable villain, it had real weaknesses. Weaknesses that people exploited. But to understand that, we need to talk about how the 2015 season evolved over the year. Well, actually, to understand what happened in 2015, we have to go back to 2014 first, the first year of Generation 6. 2014 was the first year that we ever played with one of Pokemon's most impactful mechanics, Mega Evolution. And from the jump, everyone agreed, Mega Kangaskhan was the best. That didn't mean that it won every tournament. Plenty of people played Mega Mawile or Charizard, or even some outliers like Venusaur and Gyarados and Lucario. In fact, with so many Mega Evolutions to choose from, not a single Kangaskhan made it to the top 8 at Worlds. But if there's anything that this video is supposed to illustrate, it's that the top 8 at Worlds doesn't always tell the whole story. And for the rest of the year, Kangaskhan was an absolute menace. I think if you asked most people which Mega defined that year, they would still say Kangaskhan, even though it didn't have a great showing at Worlds. And the reason for that is that after a full year of domination, every single Worlds competitor was focused on stopping the mom and her iPad kid, building their team specifically to counter it in multiple ways. This World Championship saw a huge uptick of Mega Mawile when paired with Gothitelle, a combination specifically designed to counter Mega Kangaskhan. So, Kangaskhan underperformed at Worlds, but going into the next year with more Pokemon available, it was still looking like the #1 Mega Evolution to beat. But Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire introduced a whole host of other Mega Pokemon that threw a pickle into the equation. The most notable ones were Mega Metagross and Mega Salamence, both of whom seemed to be competing for the title of Best Mega Evolution right from their release. Kangaskhan now had new rivals to contend with in the Mega slot. In fact, in more than just the Mega slot. That Landorus Therian that we mentioned before, the most used Pokemon in the format suddenly sporting Intimidate, wasn't exactly appealing news to Kangaskhan. Not to mention the fact that Salamence itself brought the same ability before it Mega evolved. In 2014, Mega Charizard Y had sometimes been a threat to Kangaskhan. With the same speed stat as Kangaskhan and the ability to really do big damage, it was not only as fast as Kangaskhan, but it also threatened really big damage that could even blow through Kangaskhan's bulk. Salamence threatened similar damage to Charizard, though it was a hair bit lower, as well as providing a way to weaken Kangaskhan's damage output. Not to mention, Salamence could blow up Amoonguss and matched up really well into Landorus, who were two of Kangaskhan's most standard partners. Just one little introduction into the metagame can cause a whole spiraling butterfly effect, and this was well more than just one little wing beat, with hundreds of new Pokemon becoming tournament legal in 2015. As Salamence became more popular, so too did Trick Room Mega Gardevoir, thanks to its ability to threaten a KO and turn Salamance's speed against it. And then Metagross swings back into popularity to beat both of them, another Pokemon that resists Kangaskhan's normal type moves. Mega Mawile even made a reappearance once or twice. Things have become a little complicated for good old Kangaskhan and her friends. Do these developments mean that Kangaskhan was just dead in the water? No, of course not. But it also wasn't really thriving, especially not in the same way that it was for most of 2014. It really depended on the day and the tournament. Just a glance at some of the national level tournaments that took place before Worlds paints an interesting picture. At the UK Nationals, my good friend Marcus won the whole thing with Kangaskhan, and it was, in fact, the most popular Mega Evolution in the top 8 finishers. Head on over to Germany and we can see a glut of Kangaskhan's, but they didn't win the tournament, falling to Metagross and Venusaur, compositions that had good matchups. And moreover, a decent amount of these teams don't even have half the letters in Chalk, and not one of them has all 5. So does that mean that people hadn't figured out that these Pokemon were really good? Or even just that they were really good with Kangaskhan? Again, no. You can see pretty much every individual member of the final Chalk core, except for Cresselia, on most of these teams. People knew that these Pokemon were strong. They even knew that they worked together well. But at the end of the day, while Kangaskhan was strong, it still had problems. It was either outrun by Salamence, Trick Room by Gardevoir, or resisted by something like Metagross. I'm not saying it was bad, it just wasn't fully figured out yet. And given what had happened at the World Championships the year prior, it was understandable that most people were hesitant to bet on Kangaskhan again. People were waiting for someone to assemble the super squad, waiting without knowing it. I wonder who that could be. An innovative team builder who crafted something so intricately well designed that it felt like a well-oiled machine. Hey, apropos of nothing, let's take a look at US Nationals, where, wow, only a single player in the top 8 had Kangaskhan at all. This team actually is just one Pokemon away from Chalk. It even has the Silent T. I wonder who this surely dashing player was. Oh yeah, now that you mention that, I do kind of remember this. At this point, you must be thinking, wow, Wolf was already on Mahokt at Nationals? Just what I expect. I bet at Worlds, he made just the precise changes he needed to pull it all together. Well, let's take a look at my Worlds 2015 team. Yep, there are some changes. Looks a little bit different, but you want to know the real surprising thing? I thought that this team was better than my Nationals team, and to be honest, I still do. I think that my Nationals team was not very good. I was not the person to figure out how to put Chalk together. And even though I had lots of the right Pokemon, spiritually, this team is nowhere close to the true version. How is that possible? I had almost all the pieces of the puzzle. How could I be so far away? Well, it's more like I knew the picture that I was going for, but everything was cut into the wrong shapes. Remember how earlier I did that whole, but you've heard from every Pokemon creator before about how complex building a Pokemon team is? Well, if there's anything that you should have taken away from that, it's that choosing the right Pokemon is only half of the battle. I might have found most of the right Pokemon, but without the right sets, this team will never fit together to form that beautiful picture. I was not the person to figure out Chalk. I said earlier that people around the world were doubting Kangaskhan, but that's not entirely true. One region in particular still saw loads of Kangaskhan, and the seeds of a team that would soon come to define Pokemon history. Let's head to yet another national championship, where the team that would rule the World Championships was truly born, and where we can figure out just why it was so successful. It's time to head to Japan. These are the results from the Japanese National Championship in 2015. Here, you can see the prototype of what would become Chalk. And for the first time, all 5 Pokemon in the acronym were assembled by the winning player, Shoma Honami, along with a Mega Charizard Y. Spoiler alert, Shoma would swap Charizard Y for Thundurus. And if that looks familiar to you, that's because Shoma will go on to win the World Championships with these 6 Pokemon. So, what made Shoma's team so special? Well, the most obvious standout here is Cresselia. That's the piece that I didn't have on my team, right? The only member that we didn't see in the Nationals results? It makes sense to start there. See, you might remember that one of Kangaskhan's weaknesses was that it got outrun by things like Mega Salamence. A lot of trainers just accepted that this was part of the deal when using Kangaskhan, and decided to handle Salamence in other ways, with fairy types like Sylveon, or things that deterred it from switching in, like competitive Milotic. Kangaskhan's speed might not be enough to match Salamence, but what can you do about it? Kangaskhan can only go so fast. But Shoma wasn't content to leave things that way. He decided to run Trick Room on a team centering around a base 100 speed Pokemon, considered fast for the time, considered Ogerpon food now. This call meant that suddenly, Kangaskhan had a way of moving before every single Mega Evolution, whether inside Trick Room or outside of it. Shoma gave his Kangaskhan just a couple points in its speed, just enough to overshoot max speed Tyranitar by a couple points, a range that a lot of Pokemon like to hang out in at the time. But by investing only a few points, it ensured that Kangaskhan would be slower than the fast Pokemon in Trick Room. And that's where things flipped, because suddenly Kangaskhan wasn't so vulnerable to getting blown up by Charizard or Metagross or Salamence or Lucario or even other faster Kangaskhan. By only putting a couple points in its speed, it freed up other stat points for both bulk and its attack, whereas other Kangaskhan normally sacrificed their bulk in favor of speed. This meant once you were in Trick Room, Kangaskhan was favored not just in its speed, but in its survivability. Instead of running a race he was guaranteed to lose, Shoma set the finish line in the other direction. Other than Kangaskhan, a huge amount of the Mega Pokemon used in 2015 were special attackers, and Shoma was prepared for that as well. While most Landorus Therian up to this point were running either the Choice Scarf or the Focus Sash, Shoma opted for the Assault Vest item, letting Landorus be tanky against the attacks that mattered. In fact, all of Shoma's Pokemon were tanky in the right situations. That style of bulky bulky offense that we talked about earlier is on full display here. Other than Landorus and Kangaskhan, every single Pokemon had nearly maxed out its HP and virtually no speed, again letting Shoma's version function incredibly well inside of Trick Room. Finally, the addition of Thundurus in between Nationals and Worlds let Shoma have another form of speed control outside of Trick Room, and it helped slow the pace of the game down to a crawl, creating those positive variance outcomes we discussed earlier. In keeping with the solid, bulky style, Shoma's Thundurus is fully invested in its special bulk, and it held the safety goggles to handle a Moongus, at a time when most Thundurus opted for Citrus Berry or for another defensive item. To be clear here, it's probably not entirely fair to give Shoma complete credit over this entire team. Pokemon teams are a nebulous thing. Sometimes two ideas develop in parallel, or one concept from one player inspires another who builds on it. It's not possible to easily do a full genealogy of a team. Shoma wasn't the only person to run bulky Kangaskhan or Assault Vest Landorus, or even to think of bulky offense as a style for this particular team. But he was the one who made the puzzle whole, and given that he won both Nationals and Worlds with this team, it feels fair to give him the lion's share of the credit. So, to answer a question from earlier, yes, part of the reason that Chalk wasn't showing up before Worlds is because no one had fully figured it out yet. It was a sharp and forward-thinking adaptation to refocus on Kangaskhan's bulk and ability to stay consistent, thereby enabling its strong teammates. Shoma even opted to use the move Low Kick over Power Up Punch, something that reduced Kangaskhan's ability to sweep through opponents' teams, but improved consistency by a ton due to being able to immediately do damage on opposing Kangaskhan and Heatran before setting up. But even though Chalk really kicked off after Japan Nationals, it's not like it was a secret going into Worlds. Once Shoma won Nationals, people started to take notice of the team, and it plays super well in several other Japanese tournaments. In fact, Marcus actually told me about Chalk before Worlds, and I didn't really pay it that much attention, because I thought I had a good matchup into it. We all knew about Chalk, we respected the team, so it wasn't a surprise to see Chalk at Worlds. The real surprise was just how ridiculously well it did. Of course, I've been saying we here, but it's not like this was true of the entire world. You might have noticed that 7 of the world's top 8 that year were all from Japan, including every Chalk player. Post-Japan Nationals, the Japanese scene came to a consensus. Chalk was the strongest team. So many Japanese players proceeded to spend the time in between Nationals and Worlds, honing their skills with it. Nationals took place in June, while Worlds took place in August. That's a not significant amount of time. And while other regions invested into different strategies, a large portion of Japanese players prepped their blackboards and sharpened their chalk. You can see from the results how that worked out. So surely they saw Shoma's team, realized how necessary the changes that he'd made were, and smartly piloted them to the top. Except they didn't. Because even though Chalk was there 6 different times, none of these teams were the same. I just yammered on about how Shoma figured out a bevy of optimizations that created Chalk, and I stand by that. But let's look at these other Chalk teams in the top 8 and see how they stacked up. Those other Landoruses? Only one other Chalk Landorus held the Assault Vest. The other 4 opted for Life Orb, Yachi Berry, or Focus Sash. That low kick, so crucial to Kang's consistency, only half of them had it. And Shoma was absolutely the only player to opt for Sunny Day on a Moongus, as a way to not only boost Heatran, but also directly counter rain teams, like the one that had just won the US Nationals the month prior. I say all of this not to detract from Shoma's fellow top 8 competitors, but to lift them up and to dispel the notion that Chalk was ever one single team. It got the catchy name because that was the version that won Worlds, and because, to be honest, it just so happened to make a really cool sounding acronym. Have you ever heard of fake PG? I didn't think so, and I should apologize. I'm sorry for the jump scare, Sun and Moon players. Gigalith can't hurt you anymore. It is true that this is the least variance in Pokemon picks that we've ever seen at Worlds in the top 8 level, but the Pokemon themselves were still extremely different from player to player. You will not find an identical one from team to team. I guarantee you. And here's the thing, that makes these players better team builders. Because you have to keep in mind, these were the days of hidden information, when all your opponents knew about your team was what they could infer from the 6 sprites in front of them. Using a popular team, but switching up the items and the moves, gave you a huge edge. And it's another hidden part of what made this team so strong, the variation between Pokemon. When you were facing down a Landorus, you weren't just battling that Landorus, you were battling the memories of 1,000 Landorus you'd seen before, each with different items, moves, spreads, and natures. It helped that each one of these Pokemon had multiple viable movesets and items that they could run, which isn't the case for every Pokemon. In a weaker team, you might be able to suss out the specifics of a Pokemon just based on the holes that it had to fill in the team. But in a team with so few holes, the Pokemon were capable of covering for each other in a variety of different fashions. If every one of these players had truly used a carbon copy of one of these chalk teams, they almost certainly would have done worse, even if they were using the version that won Worlds. Information would spread throughout the tournament about the Landorus item, the Thundurus moves, and players would be able to test their game plans in real time, maybe losing to one Japanese player, but figuring out how to win against the next one. The diversity of the team was, in my opinion, crucial to its success. To understand this better, let's look at Daiki Moriyama and Hayato Takahashi, the only other two players to have the full chalk core. Daiki's Cresselia didn't even have speed control, and while we don't know all of the details of the stats of his team, we can tell from the natures of the Pokemon that they weren't slow. He had a speed boosting nature on all of his Tyranitar, Landorus, and Heatran, but thanks to Choice Scarf Tyranitar and his unconventional 4-attack Cresselia, Daiki was still able to output good damage, whether by outspeeding the opponent through other means or simply wailing away with a Cresselia you kept predicting to click the Trick Room it didn't even have. Hayato, on the other hand, did opt for Trick Room, but his Cresselia also packed Icy Wind. While Shoma's team was built to operate inside of Trick Room except for the genies, Hayato had a speed boosting Leftovers Heatran and a speed boosting Life Orb Landorus on the one side, then a speed lowering Scrafty and a special attack boosting Cresselia on the other, with Kangaskhan meeting them in the middle. A team that was built to function inside of Trick Room or out. And all of that isn't even touching on the different attacking moves that players selected. Here's the unintuitive part of Chalk's success. By using Pokemon people were used to, you actually increased unpredictability. Many different versions of Chalk were able to succeed because while people had seen these Pokemon before, maybe even in similar configurations, they still didn't know exactly what to expect. So Chalk was not a cookie cutter template. It was a framework, a trellis on which you could grow a variety of fruitful flora, tailored to your own personal tastes. That's one myth about Chalk dispelled. Here's the next. Chalk didn't actually dominate the World Championships. Yes, it dominated the top 8 finishers, but scroll down just a little bit and you already know what we're going to see. A whole host of different teams, almost none of them Chalk. This is where we get to the other part of why Chalk worked so well. It was a really, really good call for this particular tournament. See, we've been talking about Chalk as this big, solid team that was really hard to put down, but that's not entirely true. What was true is that the things that put it down weren't quite as popular at the time. I have a few theories about why Chalk worked so well in this particular tournament. First, the meta narrowed at Worlds compared to the rest of the year. For most tournaments that year, you would have had to prepare for a good 7 to 9 matchups, but at Worlds this year, only 6 Mega Pokemon were used more than once, and of those, Venusaur was only used twice. With the biggest stakes on the line, players gravitated to the strongest Mega Evolutions: Kangaskhan, Charizard Y, Salamence, Gardevoir, and Mawile. Unless for some reason you wanted to use Charizard X. This is of course a bit of an oversimplification. Just like every Chalk team is different, a Charizard Y team or a Gardevoir team might have had many different iterations, and Megas also weren't the only Pokemon to consider when building a team. But Chalk was well prepared for the meta that was at Worlds, and the cream rose to the top. The second reason has to do with the unique regional metas that open up in Pokemon. As I mentioned prior, most players were not feeling too good about Kangaskhan after its crash out at Worlds the prior year, except for Japan. You already know this, but the nuance here is that because Japan believed in Chalk so much, the success of one Japanese Chalk player meant the success of other players too, even if they were using Chalk themselves. If you can only catch Charmander in one region, it stands to reason that everyone there would be experts in Charmander combat, even when using Charmander themselves. Chalk was a good meta call, and because Japan had way more experience with that very meta call, the cycle started to feed itself. In addition, Worlds 2015 had an absolutely huge amount of Japanese players because of a glitch in their qualification system that made it much easier to get their Worlds invite. I believe that every player at Worlds that year deserved their spot, and I'm not saying this to disparage them in any way, but I do think that it helps to understand that there were far more Japanese players than normal that year. Putting it all together, it was a Chalk meta through and through. But as we already know, it didn't stay that way afterwards. When some people talk about Chalk, they say that it dominated 2015 after the World Championships. And while it is true that you'd run into this team all day on the ladder, the post-event results tell a different story. There were 5 regional events that took place after Worlds that used the same format. 5 top 8s, that's 40 teams. Let's count how many were Chalk or one of its variations. For our purposes, that'll mean at least 4 out of the 5 lettered Pokemon. I'm being generous here on purpose. You can probably guess why. In total, out of 40 teams, there were 12 teams, give or take a few based on the criteria, that were roughly Chalk. Now, that's obviously a lot of teams and a very strong showing, but it's not the same dominance that we saw at Worlds. So why is that? Well, as you can probably guess by now, people adapted. The cycle continued. Some adapted by changing Chalk, myself included. I won Lancaster Regionals. Oh wait, I think I said that wrong. Lancaster. There you go, Pennsylvania. You're welcome. I won Lancaster Regionals with a variation on the team that used Azumarill and Mega Gardevoir over Heatran and Cresselia. Honestly, even though it meets our criteria, this team didn't even play similarly to Chalk because all of my sets were so offensive. I had Life Orb Thundurus for crying out loud. Without the staying power or the access to Trick Room, this team felt nothing to use like the World's winning one. This is another part of the misconception about Chalk, that it's all about the Pokemon species. To be totally fair, Chalk originally only referred to 5 specific Pokemon: Cresselia, Heatran, Amoonguss, Landorus, and Kangaskhan. But its success didn't just boost those 5. It boosted bulky Mega Kangaskhan teams as a whole, new and old. And as they rose, Chalk evolved. Not just in a competitive sense, but in a semantic one. What once meant 5 specific Pokemon soon became a catch-all for bulky Mega Kangaskhan teams in general. To say Chalk dominated post-Worlds isn't really true. And honestly, even though Kang did fairly well, it didn't totally run the show either. Because, as competitive players always do, they adapted. People started to develop strategies that beat Chalk. 2 of the teams that won those regionals had Rotom Washing Machine, a Pokemon who couldn't do much to Venusaur or Gardevoir, but could burn Kangaskhan and Hydro Pump Landorus Therian and Heatran. We also saw a rise in Ghost types to better match up into Kangaskhan, whether Sableye or Aegislash or Chandelure, or my personal favorite of Mega Gengar. While Kangaskhan did have Sucker Punch, that didn't account for Ghost types clicking Will-O-Wisp, or sometimes even better, something like Perish Song. Azumarill was another potential answer to the team's bulk. Even Cresselia doesn't like to take a +6 play rough after a belly drum. When you can invalidate the bulk that's taken so much of your foe's stat points, your opponent is often left with no edge. I know I just did a whole spiel before this on how Chalk being popular was its power, but that was because the team hadn't been properly understood before. Once it was public enemy number 1, well, anything can be countered if you spend enough time figuring out how to beat it. Maybe Chalk was the Charmander, but players became the Squirtle. Or they became a new type of Charmander kitted out to beat the original Charmander. This is how a format develops. One trend begets another, and then that inspires something else, and so on and so forth, evolving either in cycles or in non-circuitous lines that we can only hope to predict. Because that prediction is the essence of how you prepare for a tournament. Every tournament is a series of questions. What do I think is popular right now? How valuable do I think beating it is? How confident in my solution am I? You can index heavily into one matchup, spread your value across many, or find a way of mixing in between. And you can't always be sure your solution hasn't already been anticipated by the next Shoma Honami of the world. The truth is, doing well at a tournament is not only about what Pokemon you use or even how you use them. It's also about when. But the fact remains, this team did something thought to be impossible at Worlds 2015. I just personally think that it's impressive, not for the reasons that people usually use for it. Let's recap the myths of Chalk. Which of them are true, which are misinterpretations, and which lie somewhere in between. First, the most basic myth. 2015 was a format dominated by one team, the least creative year in competitive Pokemon history, and a stagnant format the whole year through. I think it should be apparent by now that this is just downright false. 2015 had an incredibly diverse format, especially in the early days. People were experimenting with every Mega Evolution under the sun, eager to try out new strategies, and even once new Toy Syndrome wore off, there was a constant shift between successful teams, whether Kangaskhan, Gardevoir, Salamence, Charizard, Metagross, Venusaur, Gengar. I could go on, really. Sure, the metagame did narrow at Worlds, but other than that, it was pretty open to discovery, and there were a lot of cool, unconventional teams at Worlds too. Chalk only really came into its own right at Worlds itself, and even at that tournament, it didn't make up most of the teams, it just dominated the top 8 final finishers. Even there, only a few of the teams were true Chalk. After Worlds, there was certainly a lot of it going around, but it was still only a piece of the larger whole, and the other teams were all pretty different, which leads us to our next myth. Chalk took the world by storm, proving everyone a fool for not considering it. In actuality, Chalk was a well-known composition by the time that Worlds rolled around, especially in Japan. Its level of success was unprecedented, but our reaction was more like, wow, that's wild, as opposed to, whoa, that's wild. Chalk's success at Worlds illustrates one of the most peculiar dynamics of competitive Pokemon, one that I could honestly do a whole nother video on: how separate regions interpret a given format in wildly different ways, developing their own siloed off metagames. Japanese players bet on Chalk and won the prize for it, but it wasn't some secret weapon tech hidden away for a surprise attack at Worlds. And after Worlds? Well, that's myth number 2. Second myth: once Chalk hit the field, it took over. First of all, this is untrue because many players already knew about it and most simply opted not to use it. But did we make the wrong call? Maybe for that tournament, but when players saw how strong Chalk was, well, to be honest, they didn't all flock to it. Chalk slowly came to mean a huge subset of bulky Kangaskhan teams, but that wasn't the original definition. Bulky Kangaskhan did well, sure, it was probably the most popular team after all. But Chalk? It did okay, but true Chalk was still being countered. The line between what makes a bulky Kangaskhan team and what makes a Chalk team is a little bit blurred. Truthfully, I think that this is a distinction you're going to have to make yourself. I know some Chalk purists, and I know people who would call it Chalk, even with the vowel or some consonants missing. Whether you only admit the exact 5 or the variants, Chalk never totally ran the metagame. Personally, I leave some leeway, but either way, the very possibility that you could create your own dictionary entirely dispels our next myth. Third myth: Chalk was a cookie-cutter recipe for success. Even with the 6 Chalk teams in the world's top 8, I had to say a bunch of dumb, fake words to illustrate how people were changing them. And that's just with the Pokemon, a trend that continued after Worlds. The sets were even more varied, with nuance aplenty. Chalk was an archetype lucky enough to be developed by one of the greatest players of all time, and adopted by some other stellar trainers who each made it their own. These teams were all different, and the subtlety to that difference is, for me, part of what makes Pokemon so incredible, and so personal to every player. By the way, that's true whether you consider all 6 bulky Kangaskhan teams in World's top 8 to be Chalk, or just the 3 that did it by the letter. The extension of this false claim is that, at the top level, you can just use the same strong Pokemon to succeed. And while that's already false on the face of it, the real error is in assuming that your Kangaskhan is the same as my Kangaskhan is the same as the one belonging to that person over there. Species are not the only differentiating factors between Pokemon. They're different in a million different ways, even if you can't always see it from the sprite. Finally, the myth that Chalk was the strongest team ever created. This is, it's not really a myth. I mean, strongest ever is kind of hard to gauge, but I did put it in the title of this video, so maybe. I don't think that Chalk was as dominant as it was made out to be, nor was it as simple, but it was an incredible team. There's no way I can deny how wild it is to see the same archetype populate most of the top 8. However, in my honest opinion, Chalk was not the strongest team of all time, even though many competitive players would disagree. The true strongest team of all time would appear 1 year later and put on a show even more impressive than what Chalk accomplished. But that's a story for another time. So Chalk might not have been the strongest, but if it wasn't, it sure got close. And even if it wasn't the strongest, I would argue it's one of the most misunderstood teams of all time. And yes, it was incredibly strong. Shoma and everyone else who contributed to this team along its long, layered conception truly made one of the greatest teams of all time. And I don't think anyone would argue that Chalk was the strongest team of the entire 2015 season. That players countered it later isn't evidence against that. It's proof of its legacy. Chalk was, no reservations, at the highest level of team building that we saw that year, even with all the downplay that I've been doing. It showcases so many of the dynamics that go into a format story, from making a call for one tournament, to region-specific trends, to the ebb and flow of a team going between too common and just common enough. Each of these are not the monolithic picture painted by a top 8 graphic. They are the very specificities that make playing Pokemon not just a game about showing up to a tournament and battling, but everything that happens in between as well. Chalk's history is not just the story of a team. It's an illustration of the social and chronological currents that shape Pokemon, the whirls and eddies we have to instinctively read if we want to compete at the highest level. It's a hard task. Nearly impossible, you could say. Man, do I love Pokemon. If you like this video, you might be interested to hear about how Dragonite, a Pokemon that was bad for almost 30 years, suddenly became a top threat, winning tournaments. Nobody predicted the dominance that this once forgotten Pokemon would go on to achieve.